Hello, everyone. Hope y'all are having an absolutely fantastic day. Super excited for another lesson today. My name is John Ludwig, and today we're going to be talking about improving the worst piece and why this is such an important concept, and especially as it relates to creating plans. What makes a piece bad? Just jumping into it here, we talked a lot about a few weeks ago about space and how it's the most important element of chess, or at least why I personally believe it's the most important element in chess. You know, what makes a piece good? It's two things, right? Number one, does a piece control a lot of squares, right? Does it control a lot of space? Once again, referring to the lesson a couple weeks ago about space. Chess is a game with a board of 64 squares, right? So the more squares that you control compared to your opponent, that means you have more squares to attack your opponent from, and your opponent has fewer squares to defend their position with, right? And fewer squares to counterattack you from, right? So the more space you have, usually the better off you are. So if your piece is good, usually it controls a lot of squares. It controls a lot of space on the position that helps you attack and prevents your opponent from defending as well. With that, the second point that makes a piece good usually is that it controls squares that help you facilitate your plan, right? We looked a couple weeks ago on plan creation and looked at that Janowski versus Capablanca game. And Capablanca, as black, he had this really nice bishop on f5, right? Controlling the b1 h7 light square diagonal. Just a really awesome open piece, controlled a lot of squares, but it did not help him carry out his plan. So he actually brought it inside the pawn chain on the d7 square to help with b5 and the queenside expansion that he was trying to carry out. He actually, brought the piece back and made it look, maybe not as good of a piece, maybe not controlling quite as many squares, but the squares it did control were so important and so integral to Capablanca's plan. Once again, a piece is usually going to be good if it controls a lot of space, and also if it helps carry out the plan. So on the flip side, vice versa, the piece is usually not going to be very good. It needs to be improved. It might be the worst piece if it does not control a lot of space and if it does not help carry out the plan. So usually when you have a piece that is not very good, that you want to try to put it in a position where it helps you carry out your plan, and it affect the important squares in the position that will help you carry out your plan, hopefully leading you to win the game in the end. Before we jump into today's game, I think it's a super important little word of advice from Tarash, super well-known grandmaster from a long time ago, early 1900s. A few openings named after him. He said that if you don't know what to do, just improve your worst piece. Right? Sometimes the most effective plan can just be to improve your worst piece, and being able to identify what your worst piece is based on the two factors we listed, a second ago, controlling space and helping carry out the plan. If you can improve your worst piece, that can be a very effective plan in and of itself. So if you don't know what to do, just improve your worst piece. So going into today's game, it's kind of a classic game, actually. It's Karpov versus Unziker from 1974. And so I love Karpov games. Honestly, Karpov was the most instrumental player in helping me reach the international master title. I just watched a lot of his games, or not live, but like looked over a lot of his games. I think looking over world champion games can be a very effective way to improve your style and try to try to imitate what they do, right? Because if they become world champion, if you can imitate what they do, that will obviously help you improve your chess. And Karpov was just such an important player in helping me grow. And so just love his style, love how patient he plays. And he always worked to improve all of his pieces, right? He rarely ever carried out plans when any of his pieces are bad. And so, just a really awesome player. So this game is just a pretty classic game. Really excited for this. I think Karpov really demonstrates how to improve all of your pieces, worst piece at a time. Just jumping into this game here, we have Ruy Lopez starting out here. Just a classic Ruy Lopez. I'm sure some of y'all maybe played the Ruy Lopez. I've played the Ruy Lopez with both colors with pretty decent success. Actually, I think I've had a little more success on the black side of the Ruy Lopez than the white side. Ruy Lopez, super fun opening. It can be a very exciting or just a very positional, theoretical opening. just kind of whatever you want it to be. It's just a really cool opening, very sound. So for both colors, and so just before we get it any further into this game, kind of a funny story that I always shared with my students. Every time I see this game, I'm like, wow, the Rui Lopez just looks so easy. And Karpov had a couple other Rui Lopez games where he just totally outclassed his opponent from the white side. And I was like, wow, the Rui Lopez just looks, it looks so easy to play. White just has a guaranteed advantage, all the stuff. And then you actually play it in practice, in a real tournament game. You're like, wow, this is really hard. How did Karpov do that, right? And I always say that, like, more than any other player in chess history, Karpov made chess look easy. Just so patient, never gave his opponent any counterplay, and part of that was because he always focused on improving his worst piece and made all his pieces so good that combined, net, gain from having all those pieces active just was overwhelming to his opponent's position. So if you want to improve in the Rui Lopez, honestly, with either color, especially from the white side, definitely look at some Karpov games. So especially this one, Bishop B5, B6, just a classic Rui Lopez. We have here with a classic closed Rui Lopez with Bishop E7, Rook E1, B5, Bishop B3, and after D6. Unziker as black is like, hey, I'm not even going to play. I'm not going to play the Marshall Gambit. I'm not going to do anything like that. I'm just going to play the classic, classic closed Rui Lopez from the black side. So C3 castles H3. D4 is also a playable move. The downside of that is it allows Bishop G4, kind of putting some pressure on the knight on F3, which helps defend the center. So H3 gives the king on G1 an escape square, as well as makes the bishop on C8 not quite as good of a piece because it cannot go to the G4 square. So this is the classic main line. I mean, this is one of the most fundamental variations in all of chess that we have here in this position. So in this position, Unziker plays knight to A5, which is the Chigorin variation. And so this is actually the most, traditionally most popular move in this position. A few other moves that you have. You have the Briar, which is knight to b8, which is maybe honestly a little bit more popular nowadays than knight to a5. Maybe like more favorable from the modern perspective. The idea is to go knight to d7, just to improve the pieces. It's not as immediately aggressive, but it's also not as committal as putting the knight on the rim on the a5 square. And then just go bishop b7 and c5, and just have just every piece being good. You also have bishop b7 and rook to e8 with the Zaitsev variation, a few other sidelines as well. In this position, Unziker plays knight to a5. And so, this is the Chigorin variation. Once again, puts immediate pressure, forces the bishop back to c2, c5. Karpov doesn't want to give up his bishop pair by allowing knight takes b3. So he brings it back to c2, c5. And then, this this game honestly could discourage a lot of players from playing the Chigorin from the black side. The Chigorin is it's very aggressive, right? Knight a5, c5, right? It's bringing all the pieces, being active, controlling central squares, gaining queenside space, very aggressive, right? Talked about space, very important, right? The big issue with the Chigorin in this game, Karpov really exposes this weakness, is this knight on a5 is just not a good piece at all, right? And so black has to resort to some kind of weird methods of trying to bring the piece back in, whether it's knight to c6 or it's knight to c4 to b6. But this knight just never really has a way to be that great for sometimes the rest of the game. This game definitely shows that to its extreme. And so usually it's hard, even if the knight comes back to c6, sometimes it could be kicked with d4, d5, as we see in this game. So I've actually played this as black, and so I know, like, you have to be very careful from the black side that your pieces just aren't terrible. So yeah, that's, I guess, the flip side, the negative side of playing so aggressively so quickly and advancing the pawns. So another downside with the Chigorin, this game kind of shows that, is even though you're gaining a lot of space so quickly, by putting the pawn on c5 right away, you kind of lose a little bit of flexibility with your pawn structures, right? You're already committed to the pawn on c5. You see in the Briar, like when the knight comes to d7, usually black can just put his pawn on c6 sometimes and just kind of fortify the queen side. That option is not available in the Chigorin. So Karpov really exploits these weaknesses to its full effect here. E4 aggressive, playing the center, queen c7, knight bd2. and now knight to c6. And so, nowadays no one is going to play knight to c6. It's just not a very good move. And I think a lot of people understand, like after this game, that knight c6 is just honestly not a very good move at all. Most people nowadays would play something like c takes, with the idea that after c takes, maybe like bishop d7, bringing the rook to c8 and putting pressure on this bishop on c2. Once again, white's development's a little slow here with this bishop on c1, not being able to come out immediately. Since the bishop can't come out, this rook on e1 cannot come out right away. So really just trying to put pressure on white's position, not just in the center, but also on the queen side. So that's just a more modern, more effective, honestly, more effective way to play this position. There's also taking on d4 and then bringing the knight back to c6 and possibly to b4. That's another line as well. Black's okay in this position overall. But here, knight to c6, and this just kind of gives Karpov everything that he wants. d5, gaining space, knight to d8. Now this knight is just a really bad piece on d8. Just a really, really, really bad piece. I've played these positions as black before, and they are not fun. I can say that right now. I mean, this knight on b8 or d8 is just such a bad piece. It can't come back to c6 or e6 because it's obviously this pawn on d5 is so strong. And so, Unziker tries to activate another direction, but it just doesn't work, right? a4, very straight to the point from Karpov, very awesome move. Once again, the downside of playing the Chigorin is that you don't have, you've already committed your pawn structure, right, with b5 and c5, so you can't play c6 to fortify your structure. So a4 immediately, try to make use of this pin on the a file, maybe go a takes b5 is just very effective. So to meet the threat of a takes b5, Unziker plays rook to b8. Now he just takes b4. And this is just an awesome move from Karpov. A very important idea, honestly, in the Ruy Lopez from white side. This move does two things, b4. Number one, it puts pressure on the pawns that black is committed on the queen side, right? So it puts pressure on the c5 pawn. But even more importantly than that, this pawn on b4 guards the c5 and the a5 squares. So what Unziker was likely trying to do was play a move like c4 in this position and then go knight b7, knight to c5. And there, the knight's really good because then it controls the b3 and d3 squares. At that point, Unziker's probably doing totally fine as black. But b4, now that the c5 square is guarded and the a5 square is guarded, this knight, if it comes to b7, which it does in this position, now has no squares to go to. So now the knight can't go to e6 and c6, and now it can't go to c5 and a5. So this knight just becomes a progressively worse piece on the board. And so this is why no one really plays this way as black anymore in the Chigorin, because the pieces just get so bad. But knight to b7, knight to f1, and this is where we really start to see Karpov really always trying to improve all of his pieces and his worst piece. And so, knight to f1, it's a standard Ruy Lopez maneuver. The idea is to put the knight to f1 and then to g3. Maybe bring the knight to f5, just bringing the knight closer to black's king. Setting up some possible mating ideas, maybe a possible kingside attack. But also, knight to f1 opens up this bishop. Can go to e3 now and just start putting some more pressure on black's queenside structure. So not only improving the knight on d2, going to f1 and then to g3, but also improving the dark square bishop. So once again, always improving the pieces. Bishop d7, bishop d3. Once again, improving the bishop and focusing on the dark squares, putting pressure on the dark squares. Rook to a8, and now queen to d2. And, once again, this just really highlights just kind of how bad this knight is on b7. Honestly, black probably wishes he could just take his knight out of b7 and just be down a piece, honestly. Because, with this knight on b7, it actually prevents the queen from going to b7, which is really black's most effective way to try to fight for the a file. Maybe go rook takes and then bring the other rook to a8. Try to, with the queen on b7, try to fight for the a file. But because the knight's on b7, the queen can't come here. So there's really no way to effectively guard the a8 square for the rook to come over, right? So this knight on b7 is just a really terrible piece. Karpov, by going queen to d2, just connects the rooks and is prepared to take back on a1 with the rook, once again regaining control of the a file. So queen to d2, rook to c8. The threat here is c takes b4, and then with the pin on the c2 bishop. So Karpov just sidesteps that with bishop to d3 and starting to put pressure on the b5 pawn. g6, knight to g3, once again continuing improvement of the pieces. After bishop to f8, we have rook to a2. And so this is just a really awesome move from Karpov. And this is really another element or another part of the game where we see him really trying to improve his worst piece. And so for this position, I would say that the worst piece in Karpov's position is this rook on e1, right? This rook on e1, it's not open on the e file. It's totally blocked. And also this pawn on e4 doesn't need any defending by the rook on e1 because the bishop and the knight guard, it's defended twice, right? So how do we get this rook active? We put the other rook on a2 so we can swing the e1 rook to the a1 square. So Karpov, just having a solid understanding of what his worst piece is and just trying to improve all of his pieces. Rook to a2, c4, and now in this position, Karpov plays this really awesome move, bishop to b1, and so I really love this move. It's kind of a funny move, putting the bishop on the b1 square, especially after we just talked about it, how Karpov wants to block the rook or move the rook to the a1 square, but now it's blocked because the bishop cuts off the pipeline right between the a1 square to the e1 square to the a1 square. But really, it's just Karpov just understanding his plan, his opponent's counterplay. Unzerker is not in any danger of capturing the a file. If because this knight on b7 is such a bad piece, right? If rook takes a2, just queen takes, and there's no way for Unzerker to immediately gain control of the a file, right? Because the knight's stuck on b7. So preventing the queen from going to b7 and the rook coming to a8. And so this bishop on b1, instead of putting, let's say, on f1, this bishop actually on b1 is actually a little more effective and makes the knight on g3 a better piece. If the bishop is on f1, then this knight is stuck defending the e4 pawn and maybe can't be as active in the position. Maybe go for some knight f5 sacrifices, something more aggressive. So by putting the bishop on b1, defending the e4 pawn, it frees up this knight on g3 quite a bit. So just a cute little move from Karpov. I like it. Queen to d8. And so Unzerker's idea here is quite simple. He wants to go rook takes a2. And now that the queen is on d8, it defends the a8 square. So finally trying to control the a file, trying to fight for it, trying to play, trying to get around the fact that this knight on b7 is such a bad piece. But Karpov just nips that right in the bud here with this awesome move. And this is probably the most iconic move in the whole game. Just a really funny looking move, actually. Bishop to a7. I love this move so much. It's kind of a funny moment here because Karpov's like, hey, you want to trade my rook? I'm just going to totally block in your rook, right? This bishop is, almost making it look like Unzerker's just down in exchange. Because this bishop just totally dominates this rook on a8, totally shuts down the a file, just totally blocks it. And there's really no way for Unzerker to challenge this bishop, right? Because once again, this knight on b7 is just in the way of everything. I mean, this knight on b7 is a trash piece. So, just a really cool move from Karpov. Once again, Karpov has had such a solid understanding of what his opponent wants to do. And so you'd always play against what his opponent was trying to do. And so bishop to a7, awesome move. Knight to e8, bishop to c2. Once again, another awesome move, slow improvement. Now, finally, it's a good time to bring the rook into the a1 square now that everything has resolved itself. And so, once again, improving the worst piece. Knight to c7, rook on a to e1. Karpov has successfully improved his worst piece. And so now, queen to e7, bishop to b1. Just a small little improvement move from Karpov. This is very typical of his style. Basically, he frees up a little bit more room for the queen on d2. Maybe Karpov could do something like rook a3, other rook to a2, queen b2, queen to a1. Set up kind of an Alekhines like a triple file lineup, try to conquer the a file. That could be very effective. But just once again, slow improvement in the position. Unzerker's black has no play at all, right? There's no going f5 because Karpov controls it 1, 2, 3 times. So there's no play on the king side. Obviously, no play on the queen side for black because these pawns are fixed and the a file has been shut down by Karpov. So Karpov is free to take his time and slowly improve all of his pieces, which is such a nice luxury to have in a chess game. So we have bishop to e8, knight to e2. Once again, Karpov is like, okay, you know what? My knight on g3, I don't really want to go for immediate sacrifices yet, so I'm just going to improve my pieces, right? I'm just going to improve my worst piece, which in this position you could argue is actually this knight on g3. So he goes knight to e2. After knight to d8, knight to h2. And usually, this can happen quite a bit in chess games, right? Sometimes the best way to improve your worst piece is by opening up space. And that makes sense. So maybe trade some pawns, maybe trade some pieces off, because when you trade material, that opens up space, and so some of the piece that maybe didn't have as many squares because there's more stuff in the way, right? More pieces, more pawns in the way, suddenly has more activity because there's more free space in the position. So now, by Karpov has the idea of opening up space in the position by going for f4 and really trying to crack open the position, open up the f file, open up the king side, and also this knight could come to the g4 square, where it's more effective, closer to black's king on g8 than it was on the f3 square. So once again, just playing with purpose, opening up all the pieces, improving the worst piece, right? So bishop g7, f4. Very active, very aggressive. Um, Honestly, in this position, Unziker plays f6, which is just so passive. Honestly, it probably was best for him just to take on f4, and then Karpov probably would have just gone knight takes f4, making use of the fact that the knight's on e2 instead of where it was previously, on g3. And then Karpov probably would have brought the knight to g4 and just been very active, probably launch an attack on the king side. But that's still better. At least the bishop would be open on this diagonal. At least there'd be some sort of maybe activity. But Unzerker just played f6, and I mean this is just so passive. I mean this is just not ideal at all. And Karpov's like, okay, more space for me, easy, f5. G5. And from this point on, this is another area that Karpov is so strong in, right? Anytime his opponent made a slight weakness in the position, Karpov was on it, right? He's like, okay, I'm going to improve all of my pieces. I'm going to focus all of my attention on taking advantage and exploiting those weaknesses that my opponent's created. So here, by playing G5, and just the few moves that Black has done by playing F6 and G5, Unzerker as Black has totally destroyed his own light squares. I mean, just look at E6, F7, G6, H5, and Karpov's like, okay, I'm going to improve all of my pieces by taking advantage of those squares. And so bishop to c2, bishop to f7, knight to g3, knight to b7, bishop to d1, immediately looking to just take advantage of these light squares right on the h5 square, and maybe bring the other knight to g4, right? And so this is also effective, right? Because this bishop on b1 wasn't really doing too much. So if you can trade for the f7 bishop and just really fight for those light squares, that could be very effective here. That's what Karpov is going for. So here, h6, weakening more light squares. I mean, that's usually not the best strategy if you're black, but I think Unziker may have been trying to just put his king on h7, try to hold the position together on the king side, but I mean, I feel like h6 is probably a little uncalled for, just weakening more light squares. So bishop to h5, once again, continuing the plan, being very effective. Queen to e8, trying to fight for those light squares, but Karpov's like, okay, I'm not giving you the light squares so easily. I'm going to play queen to d1, and so just very effective. Knight to d8. And now, just a really, really awesome move. I love this move. Rook to a3. Such a simple, slow move, right? There's no need to rush anything. Black has no play on the king side, center, or queen side, right? So by playing rook to a3, king to f8, rook 1 a2, now Karpov can play on both flanks, right? He can decide if he wants to bring his queen to the king side, right, via the h5 square, or he can now bring it to the a1 square and really try to crash in on the a file. Just a really awesome, slow, patient idea from Karpov. And so king to g8, I mean, Unziker has nothing to do as black here. Knight g4, making use of a nice little tactic here. Here, Unziker plays king f8. If bishop takes h5, trying to win the piece, knight takes h5, queen takes h5, knight takes f6 is just going to win the queen on h5. So that's not good for black. So Unziker's like, okay, I'm just going to, slowly just king f8, and, now Karpov's like, okay, my bishop on h5 is now hanging because knight takes f6 does not come with check, so I'm just going to resume the defense of my bishop on h5. Knight to e3. The knight has improved slightly on e3 compared to h2, a little bit more in the center of the game, right? So here we have king to king to g8, bishop takes f7, queen, knight takes, I'm so sorry, queen to h5. Once again, just infiltrating with all the pieces. So now we have an attack happening on the queen side, right, and also an attack happening on the king side. Knight to d8. Unziker might like to trade queens. I mean, even that wouldn't be ideal in this position. If queen takes e8, but Unziker is like, hey, any space freed up would help me out. Usually when you're down on space, trading pieces helps you because it frees up space in your own position. Karpov's like, hey, you can trade queens, but on my terms. Queen to g6. Really, really, really awesome move. Just a really cool move. This does two things. Number one, it basically sets up a trade in the best way possible. So if queen takes g6, f takes g6, now this e3 knight can come to f5, right? And then the other knight can come to h5 and just devastate the position. And this pawn on g6 guards the f7 square. So once again, this knight on d8 has no squares at all. So these knights are just getting totally dominated. But also the queen on g6, now that it's here, frees up the h5 square for the knight to come in, which is exactly what we see here. So king to f8, knight to h5. And so in this position, Unziker's black actually resigned. Karpov is threatening mate on g7. And so, let's say Unziker defends it with something like queen to e7. Now just knight to g4 is going to be totally fatal. This pawn on f6 is hanging. This pawn on h6 is hanging. This knight is just, I mean, everything is just hanging, just falling apart. There's really no way to hold it. I mean, even if like knight to e8, just knight takes h6, and it's just totally game over. No counterplay at all for black. And so in this position, after knight to h5, once again, just bringing all the pieces in. In this position, Unziker resigned as black. And so just a really, really awesome game. I just love this game so much. Karpov just striving to prove all of his pieces right. We see that, quite a few times. We see that with knight to f1, right? Putting the knight on, that's on d2, getting closer to black's king, as well as improving the bishop that was stuck on c1, bring it to e3. We see that with rook to a2. Now the e1 rook, that's the worst piece in the position, can slide into the a1 square and really challenge the a file, right? And so Karpov just really has an awesome understanding. He's like, okay, with my knights, they're not really doing anything immediately. I can't, gain an attack in the position. Try to open up the position, gain more space for the pieces so they can come into the game, right, on effective squares. So, and we just really see Karpov just improving all of his pieces to the absolute maximum, right? And so sometimes, when you're playing a game, and we really see this here, once we reach the final position, if you can improve all of your pieces to the absolute maximum, your opponent's position is inevitably going to fall apart because all the pieces are just hammering in and carrying out the plan. So, if you really don't know how to try to crash into your opponent's position, you're just wondering what to do. How do I improve my position so I can try to crash in? Usually, the answer to that is just improve your worst piece. Sometimes bringing that one extra piece, that final piece, can be the final piece of the puzzle, and can really result in winning the game on the spot there. So just a really awesome game. Really hope y'all enjoyed this game. I think improving improving the worst piece is a very important concept. Improving all of your pieces is very important, and just very important for how to play thematically, play with plan and purpose. And so always like to improve your pieces, especially the worst piece. You might be surprised to see how quickly that results in the demise of your opponent's position. So once again, my name is John Ludwig. Hope y'all enjoyed today's lesson. I really enjoyed today's lesson. Hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening in, and I look forward to talking to y'all soon. Bye.